Welcome to the first BRISMES event of 2021. I want to wish you all a very happy and peaceful new year, and hopefully a healthy new year as well. I'm Dr. Teodora Todorova, and I will be hosting today's event, which is moderated by the Outreach and Pedagogy Subcommittee of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. The theme of today's roundtable is New Voices in Middle Eastern Studies, and this event brings together critical scholarly voices who will reflect on the legacies of the 2010-11 revolts across the Middle East and North Africa. And particularly, they will be looking at the opportunities and obstacles for meaningful social, political, and economic transformation in the region. Before I hand over to my distinguished colleagues, I would like to run through the run of events. Each speaker will take about 15, a maximum of 20 minutes to make a contribution on the theme. And at the end of the presentations, I will open up the discussion to you as our audience for questions and reflections. If I can please ask you to keep your microphones on mute, though you are welcome to put your cameras on because it is always nice to see friendly and engaged faces. That will be very much appreciated. And once we open up the contributions, we'll try to keep contributions short if possible, because we want to have as much discussion until the end of the event at 6 p.m. Thank you once again for joining us. Without further ado, I'm going to present the contributors to today's roundtable in the order in which they will speak. Firstly, I have to give apologies from Dr. Mark Owen-Jones, who unfortunately will not be able to join us because he has been feeling poorly for the last few days, and hopefully he's okay and he'll feel healthier very soon. Our first speaker will be Dr. Yara Hawari, who is a senior analyst of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She completed her PhD in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter, where she has taught various undergraduate courses and continues to be an honorary research fellow. In addition to this, she focuses on Indigenous studies and oral histories, and you may be familiar with her frequent commentary contributions to various media outlets that include Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera English, and The Guardian. She will be followed by Dr. Mezna Qato, who is a historian of the modern Middle East and is particularly focused on migration and development and the histories of Palestinian refugees and exile communities. She has previously held positions as Spencer Fellow at the National Academy of Education and Junior Research Fellow at King's College, Cambridge. And she's currently completing a book on the history of education for Palestinians. Last but not least, we'll have Dr. Kamran Matin, who acquired his PhD in International Relations at the University of Sussex in 2009, and his doctoral thesis retheorized Iran's experience of modernity and revolution for a critical deployment of the idea of an even and combined development. He is a lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the University of Sussex. Thank you. Over to you, Yara.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Good. Thank you so much for all of you to joining this panel, and thank you to BRISMES and all the organisers for inviting me to present. To be very honest, I wasn't entirely sure what to present today when I received the invitation. I think it's quite difficult at the moment to find things to talk about that are not utterly depressing. But I started to reflect a little bit back over the last 10 years. And it's really astounding to me. It really doesn't feel like a decade on from the Arab revolutions. But I did start to find myself amidst all the doom and gloom smiling at various memories and moments. So I decided that I wanted to share some very personal experiences of social movements in the last 10 years in Palestine, which is where I live. And I want to share some of the moments that made me smile as well. But I think before I get into the nuts and bolts, I think it's important to recognize that it wasn't only Arabs who took part in the uprisings, and non-Arabs also had revolutions of their own, such as the Kurdish people. And we're a diverse and multi-ethnic region, and Arab majorities and dominance means that we often forget that. The revolutions, as we all know, are often attributed as having been started in Tunisia with a man called Mohammed Bouazi, who famously and rather tragically set himself alight in total frustration and despair at his personal situation, which was as a street vendor, who was in dire economic straits and was constantly getting harassed by the police and having his wares confiscated. Some say that there were other starting points, such as Noam Chomsky, who points to the Sahrawi protests in Gdamazek against the Moroccan regime's expansionism and colonialism in October of 2010. But I think to pinpoint an exact starting point is a bit too simplistic. I think we can always highlight catalysts and tipping points. But what happened in 2010, 2011, and since really has been as a result of decades of continuous struggle for self-determination, really, in the region. The Egyptian revolution, for example, was not just the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, but also, a long series of strikes by millions of doctors, of bus drivers, of laborers, all in the decades running up to the revolution. So if I look back to 2011, I was just finishing my BA degree in the UK, and I remember thinking to myself and seeing the images on television that if this sparks something in Palestine, I'm on the first plane home. And it didn't spark in the way that some might have expected or hoped. And I remember at the time there were loads of articles asking why Palestine hadn't joined in the Arab Spring, or where was the Palestinian Spring. But I think these pieces significantly overlooked some of the things that were going on in Palestine and amongst Palestinians at the time. And I really would like to highlight some of these. So I'm sure some of you might remember the March of Return that took place in May 2011. This was a march organized by various Palestinian groups in Syria to commemorate the Nakba and really to center the right of return. What happened was several hundred Syrian Palestinian refugees marched towards the border between Syria and the Israeli occupied town of Majd al-Shams in the Syrian Golan. And as they approached closer and closer to the border, the people on the other side, or the fence, I should say, the people on the other side in Majd al-Shams were shouting at them and waving at them to stop, really out of fear that they would be injured by landmines. But the protesters didn't take any heed to the warnings, and they continued until they reached the fence, and then they proceeded to climb over the fence. And these images and videos were so shocking and phenomenal. And this is the first memory that really forced a smile. Here was a fence, not at all protected by mines as we had thought, with no massive concrete wall, seemingly no Israeli soldiers guarding it, something that had kept out Palestinian refugees from their homeland for so long. And this actually reminds me of whenever I take people to the north of Palestine, the Galilee region, where I'm from, which borders Lebanon and the Golan. And for the first time they see it, they're so shocked that there isn't this huge wall like the one in the West Bank. But of course there is less visible security, smart monitoring, smart fences and drones, etc. But I think it really highlights how much we've internalized our separation from the region and neighboring countries so much that we've created these massive walls in our minds. Anyway, so the protesters were greeted, when they climbed over the fence, they were greeted by the villagers in Majd al-Shams, and there were all these emotional embraces, and they were declared heroes. And rather remarkably, one young man, his name is Hassan Hijazi, he made it all the way to Jaffa, where his family were expelled from in 1948. And Hassan obviously wanted to make his return public. So he gave himself up and declared in an interview on Israeli television the following. He said, "It's been my dream to come to Jaffa because it's my city. But I imagine that if I managed to do it, it would be with a march of 1 million people, like they were saying on Facebook." And I found this very poignant. I think it highlighted that really return cannot just be for a few individuals. It has to be collectively fulfilled. And for so many, this march was amazing in so many ways because it actually actualized return for a brief moment in time. It broke that fear of the Israeli border. But it was sort of short-lived because it didn't spark mass movements of refugees to the borders for various reasons. Of course, in Syria, Palestinians were going through their second Nakba. Many other Palestinians across the region were really fighting hard for survival in their host countries. Now, 2011 also saw something else important in Palestine, a Palestinian youth-led movement demanding reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah. It was called the March 15th movement, and it was really inspired by a lot of the other regional movements happening at the time. And the main slogan reflected this, الشعب يريد إنهاء الانقسام, which means the people want the end to the division. And according to the movement's leaders themselves, reconciliation was only one of the first demands. It also had eyes set on rehabilitating the scattered Palestinian national body and holding Palestinian National Council elections that would include all Palestinians regardless of geographic location and circumstance. So its ultimate goal was really to reconstruct a Palestinian national program based on a comprehensive resistance platform. And it was a very, very significant movement. You know, we saw tens of thousands of Palestinians hit the streets in the West Bank, in Gaza, in 48, in the diaspora. The movement eventually dissipated for various reasons. There was also a pretty strong crackdown on the activists by the Palestinian authorities in both the West Bank and Gaza, and it was quite intense. And I think here we saw a particular turning point in what has become an increasingly gendered crackdown from the Palestinian authorities. And here I'm going to be speaking mostly about the West Bank experience. So over the decades, we know the Palestinian Authority has become increasingly authoritarian, cracking down on activism and activities that challenge its authoritarianism, and they use various techniques like interrogation, detention, surveillance, limits on mobilization, cyber attacks, etc. And it's not at all surprising that it's adopted gendered mechanisms very similar to those used by the Israeli army to deter female participation in political activities. And what we've seen and experienced is that demonstrations and protests have often been the sites of very gendered forms of violence. So, for example, there are frequent examples when the Palestinian Authority security forces use insults and insinuations that often amount to verbal sexual harassment, in addition to telling women that they should be at home and not in the streets, drawing on all these misogynist and global notions of honor and shame, which can be then mobilized against women's families. And the PA security forces have been known to actually visit women's and girls' fathers to discuss their activism. For some women, this has very serious repercussions. It means that they are prevented by their families from taking part in political activities. And there have actually even been cases where security forces have gone to a female activist's place of work and have spoken to her employer in an attempt to get her fired. This type of sabotage also can happen on social media in much more easily. Rumors, slanderous language can be spread quickly and very anonymously in ways that become very impossible to refute. So just an example of that, after the 2011 protests, there was a Facebook group set up called Nisa al-Rasif, which in Arabic, which in English translates to women on the sidewalk or the pavement. And in this Facebook group, they shared pictures of women, they shamed them, they wrote explicit comments calling these women whores, and it was very much suspected that it was the work of the security forces. And all of this was happening simultaneously at the same time when the international donor community was investing in gender awareness in the Palestinian security services, which is not a surprise at all. In 2013, a gender unit was established in the Ministry of Interior. I'm laughing because it's dystopian, not because it's comedic. So a gender unit was established in the Ministry of Interior with the declaration or the declared intention to increase women's presence in the sector. And indeed, shortly thereafter, they created women's police units. And this was a big thing because it means that now at protests and demonstrations, these units are brought out to deal with female protesters. In other words, to physically detain them or arrest them. Whereas before physical assaults, although physical assaults did happen, it was difficult for male police officers or security services to publicly arrest or manhandle women. Now, of course, severe cases of physical sexual harassment also occurred in the streets. You know, women groped and grabbed at demonstrations. This was definitely the case at a protest in 2018, in the summer of 2018, that belonged to a movement that demanded the PA lift the sanctions on Gaza. It was a youth-led movement, which at some points attracted thousands. And what happened was that the security forces, in tandem with Fatah loyalists, harassed and assaulted women at these protests. And the aim of sexual harassment of women in such spaces really was to not only punish them, but also to deter them from taking part in future demonstrations, and also to encourage male activists to deter female participation out of fear for women's safety. Now, I think it's important to note that Palestinian women have not been passive in the face of this gendered violence. And they have long confronted the weaponization of their bodies through different types of tactics, such as recognizing the right to remain silent during interrogations, always remaining in groups and pairs at demonstrations. And another tactic that I personally learned in the last few years is to mentally compartmentalize. And I'll never forget this. A comrade told me once on the eve of a demonstration, she said, I mentally prepare myself before the demonstration. I tell myself, today my body is not mine. And of course, we also unfortunately have to use this tactic in the face of Israeli violations of our bodies. So a year after this movement, the Lift the Sanctions movement, we saw a new wave of Palestinian women's activism, really spearheaded by a movement called Talat. Now, Talat in Arabic means going out or stepping out in the feminine plural form. And the banner in which this movement united under is, there is no free homeland without free women. And in Arabic, that's لا يوجد لوطن حر إلا النساء حرة. And its launch was in September 2019. And it saw thousands of women across historic Palestine, in Haifa, in Nazareth, in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Jaffa, Ramallah, Beirut. All of these women take to the streets and protest against gender-based violence in all of its manifestations. Femicide, domestic violence, embedded sexism, exploitation. But they also asserted, and the movement still asserts, that the path to true liberation must embody the liberation of each and every Palestinian, including women. So unlike the mass media representation of the movement as a group against honor killings, this is a movement against gender-based violence, but also a deeply politicized one that recognizes continuous marginalization of women from the liberation struggle contributes to this violence. So in other words, the safety and dignity of women in Palestine is not just a women's issue, but rather something which must be at the core of Palestinian liberation politics. And even though it's obviously shaped by the lived experience of more than 7 decades of Israeli settler colonial violence, this movement also sees itself as part of a revolutionary feminist tradition, seeing that oppression is systematic and structurally rooted in capitalism, intersecting with race, sexuality, and colonialism. So it really embodies a radical feminism that has long been articulated and practiced by women of color, a feminism really that goes beyond individual gender-based demands, one that sees the struggle as a just and equitable world for everyone. And now, since the first Al-Hard protests over a year and a half ago, there have been various actions and attempts to adapt to COVID, which so many movements have had to do. One such example of this was a convoy of cars in Ramallah, which blasted out from the loudspeakers the names of women who've been killed by men. And the pushback against Al-Hard comes from the authorities. In Jerusalem, comrades were beaten and arrested by Israeli police. In Haifa, there was heavy police presence at all Al-Hard demonstrations. But there's also pushback from a lot of Palestinian society, and in particular, very conservative parts of society. Now, something which has been quite interesting to me about this movement, from someone who's not only part of the movement, but also an academic, is the flurry of researchers and academics getting in touch with the movement's activists, wanting to do interviews, wanting to write their thesis on the movement, a movement which, may I remind you, was only a year and a half old. And this really ties into some wider things that I have been reflecting on in terms of social movements in the region and beyond, that these movements really take time to develop, and they need that time. There isn't a quick fix in Palestine. And in particular, we're going to have to spend decades rebuilding the grassroots and relearning revolutionary thinking and praxis, because that's something which has been constantly chipped away at and even destroyed. So I think whilst we might look back and think pessimistically about what has happened in the past decade in Palestine and the wider region, I think to do so entirely is to diminish the achievements that have been made. Recently, in a podcast with my friend and colleague Tarek Bakoni, he said to me that the Arab revolutions have, in many places, broken a wall of fear that existed for decades. Now, the final thing I wanted to mention very briefly is that, of course, over the last 10 years, we've also seen the Great March of Return in Gaza, in which Palestinians courageously marched towards the Israeli military fence in demand of their right to return home. And in doing so, hundreds lost their lives, tens of thousands were permanently injured. And I can't do justice in this very short presentation, but I thought it was really important to recognize not only that movement, but also all the martyrs that lost their lives and all the other comrades in Palestine who have been martyred and incarcerated since. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yara. If I may hand over to Mezna now. This is a big clap. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today, and for Yara for starting us off. So I guess I'm going to stick with Palestine for a moment, although think about it from a slightly different angle. And I'd like to spend my allotted time talking about unions and unionization and the transformation of unionization in the last 10 years. And I'd like to do it by way of thinking about the teachers' unions, the teachers' union in the West Bank and in Gaza, but also not just in Palestine, but in Jordan as well. I don't want to talk about the entire region because that can get a little too unwieldy, but I think some of the lessons that that I hope to bring out on Palestine and Jordan during this period can perhaps help us think about questions of unionization, industrial action, and labor across the region. So I want to begin with an image that has almost become ubiquitous in discussions of the PA and its relationship to the political economy of the West Bank. And that is the long queues and lines in front of ATMs, where every month at the end of the month or the beginning of the month, salaried Palestinian Authority workers would stand in line to get their paychecks or to withdraw their salaries. And there's a colleague and I, May Abu Mohli, Dr. May Abu Mohli, who's an education scholar, have done extensive interviews with teachers. And one of the things that one of them told us was that the image of Palestinian teachers queuing for salaries that never arrived at those ATMs was a crucial moment of realization in that line of teachers realizing that they were in this together and that something had to be done. And so what did they do? So, you know, the formation, I don't want to get into kind of the formation of teachers' unions in the West Bank and Palestine in general, or in Jordan. At the moment, it has a long history. It has a complicated history. And, you know, the role of teachers in the Arab uprisings, both as part of their unions, but also outside of their unions as members of political parties and formations, or even outside of that, in terms of their neighborhoods, in terms of their, you know, sets of social relations. They were part of the Arab uprisings, or, you know, the Arab uprisings. And they were mobilized in very similar ways to other sectors. However, in thinking about them as teachers for the moment, I'd like to draw out some of the complicated transformations that have happened to teachers in the last 10 years. And first, I'd want to talk about the transformations in economic and social and political conditions, a little bit about the transformations in political mobilization and unionization, and third, so organizational transformation that has happened amongst teachers, and third, the very conceptualization of what it means to organize as a teacher. So first, in terms of conditions. Increasingly Palestinian, you know, the sort of the storied role of Palestinian teachers as holding quite a significant amount of what we would call what some would call social capital in the last, you know, 100 odd years, has in the last 10 years in particular, grown increasingly precarious. Salaries have plummeted. Working conditions have grown more dire, much more crowded classrooms, fewer, you know, increased working hours, split classrooms, poorer benefits, late salaries that never arrive, etc. These economic conditions are shared with teachers around the world. You have seen a spike in the last 10 years. I think it's really important to also think about the Arab uprisings in terms of broad mass mobilization around the world in the last 10 years, and the teachers' unions and the mass mobilizations of teachers' unions in the United States, in Chile, in the UK, all across Europe, in India and elsewhere, have really shown that teachers as well have begun to think and work through their unions in rejuvenated ways, and have conducted enormous exercises in industrial action that have had mixed results, but must be thought of as a sort of a renewal of sorts. And this is the result of deteriorated economic conditions. But they're also a result, I think, and in particular in Palestine, of the consequent deterioration in social conditions, by which I mean that teachers have, you know, the sort of class category of teachers has significantly deteriorated. Their social capital has plummeted. There is a lack of sort of familial and local solidarity with teachers. They have seen themselves needing to take up multiple jobs that have undermined their authority, both in the classroom, outside the classroom, in the social and political spaces that they used to frequent and in which they held quite a substantial amount of authority. Quite a few teachers, for example, told us that one of the triggers for them around that, made them decide to go on strike was less a question of their economic condition, their economic situation and, their lack of salary for several months, but it was when their students started to throw 20 shekel notes at them as they walked into the classroom and mock them, or for example, would get into the taxis that they were forced to drive in for a second income in the evenings and mock them from the back seat. So that kind of sense of pride and that sense of having a place in the world began to shrink, as well as their sense of their class positionality. They were no longer sort of upper working class, middle class, as it were, and had found themselves, I guess the word is proletarianized or more in line with other working class laborers whose salaries were no longer, permitted dignified lives. And finally, politically, the conditions in Palestine, as Yara eloquently pointed out, had also in the last 10 years led to a kind of shrinking of capacity for political expression, a growing sophistication in surveillance technologies, in mechanisms of social and political control that didn't provide for any space, nor did it allow for any space for any measure of industrial action that wouldn't be responded to with a kind of repression that hasn't been felt in this way in Palestine for a very long time. In Jordan, this has been a particular problem as the state consolidates itself further against any potential for industrial action in the last 10 years. I think it was like last week, the heads of the teachers' unions in Jordan were sentenced to several years of incarceration as a result of their leadership in the industrial action of the teachers' unions in the country. So those are the conditions. I wanted to quickly talk about organizational transformation. One of the things that teachers have done in the last 10 years is to understand that their unions are not theirs, and that the relationship of the Palestinian Teachers Union to the Palestinian Authority has meant that it was unreliable, if not antagonistic representative of teachers in the West Bank and in Gaza. And this has resulted in the creation of alternative forms of organization through which teachers are beginning to build power. When in 2016, in September, well, no, wait, when was it? Anyway, February and March of 2016, when the Palestinian teachers declared the single largest sector strike in Palestinian history. 35,000 teachers went on the streets and were on strike for over 2+ months. They did so not through the General Union of Palestinian teachers, but against that union and despite it. And this has meant that they have, the rebuilding of industrial power from the ground up has allowed for an opening, a promising opening, I think, of different ways and forms for organization that thinks through and works. The aim is the same, the development and the building of industrial power, but through a kind of a new, more political, more expansive, more horizontal unionization effort. And in Palestine, this has come in the form of what are called core demands committees. And these core demands committees are elected committees at every scale of the educational infrastructure. So teachers were beginning to gather themselves up in their schools, and then in the district, and then in the governance, and then elect and begin to have conversations across all 14 governments in the West Bank to centralize their demands and to build towards them. And so when that single sector strike happened, in 2016, it was done through these core demand committees, and because of their strength was able to withstand quite an intense PA assault on the strikes. And this is ongoing. So the pushback by the PA, which picked teachers off one by one by promising them positions, by some of the mechanisms that Yara talked about, in undermining their social standing in one way or another, or by throwing them in jail or firing them, etc. The structure remains and has been reactivated during COVID, first in May and June of last year, and until the present, with partial strikes that aim to rebuild towards the same demands that were unmet in 2016. There is one thing that I kind of want to think about with you all about this transformation of union work and union politics in Palestine and in Jordan in this period. Well, actually, maybe it's two things. The first is the incredibly powerful gendered aspect of these teachers' unionization efforts, and the ways the last 10 years has allowed teachers to begin to reconfigure their social standing, not via their political affiliations, their regional attachments, their familiar attachments, but through their attachments to their unions. This has been particularly pronounced in Jordan, where about 65% of the teaching force is made up of women. And you see women from Matin and Al-Shabaka and Al-Shabaka beginning to declare allegiance to the union and not to their family or tribe or to their town. This transformation has grown, it's solidified, it's expanded in incredibly powerful ways that have kind of built in and imbricated demands of women and gender demands into the unions in ways that can't be disaggregated as they have historically tended to be. The second aspect has been a core demand that has called on the teachers' unions to not be unions of teachers or educators, syndicates, but rather unions for a sector. And that kind of I guess I would say, more generous and expansive definition of what it means to be an educator, which is not the person at the front of the, in front of the lectern in the classroom, but rather every single person, from the janitors to the cleaners to the caretakers to the plumbers to whoever is involved in the educational sector, as also being included as part of the unionization effort and as part of and incorporated into the core demands of any strike. That is a generally new phenomenon, and one that has had profound impacts on the ways teachers and educators have begun to redefine both their class composition and their relationship, and the relationship of their labor and their industrial work to the state and to political power. And so I think, I'll end with that, but I do want to say that I think that these kinds of transformations within the educational sector are important spaces to think about the longue durée of not just the last 10 years, but the last 100, and to think about the impact of these educational transformations on how we think of what it means to teach, what it means to study, and what it means to build a more robust and vibrant commons in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mezna. I'm going to hand over to Kamran, please.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Am I audible? Yeah.
Hear me?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, thanks to Teodora and Amy and BRISMES for organizing this event and inviting me to contribute, and also thanks to the preceding speakers for their fascinating talks. We were asked to reflect on the possibilities for successful grassroots mobilization for social change in Middle East and North Africa, and also to reflect on how this issue has kind of been present in our research and teaching. Now, I'm a historical sociologist, so I'm a bit wary of making predictions and reflecting on future possibilities. So I thought maybe I address both questions by looking at the causes or the broad kind of circumstances which led to the failure of the Arab uprisings, which came to be maybe problematically known as the Arab Spring. And I want to do that by looking at actually the case of the Iran, about which I know a little bit more than the rest of the Middle East. Now, the Green Movement took place roughly a year before the so-called Arab Spring, but I believe it came out of broadly similar historical and social and political economic circumstances. So I think it's not implausible to link these events together. Now, I will be focusing on the causes for failure, but I think it's important to look at the origin, in the sense that I think the Green Movement effectively and essentially came out of same set of contradictions which underlay the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which in the most fundamental sense is a contradiction between a liberal, I would say increasingly neoliberal economy, and an illiberal state. Although I'm sure in the case of Iran, many people would object to the word illiberal as being too soft in terms of describing the level of repressive nature of the Iranian state. At points, I think it can plausibly described as semi-fascist. Now, in that sense, Green Movement, in a way, a continuation of struggling and kind of trying to resolve the same fundamental contradictions, which is at the heart of the Iran's experience of capitalist development since early 20th century. But in terms of the failure, unlike you would say, in the case of Iranian Revolution, although whether that was a successful also depends on what sort of theory of history one holds. But in terms of the political sense of failure of the Green Movement, I think one has to look at the class constituency of that movement. Now, it's true that subaltern classes, working classes, the poor and women took part in the movement. But actually, if you look at the duration of the movement, which took actually several months, beyond the initial months, actually, the movement was concentrated heavily in Tehran, and it was largely driven by middle class, upper middle class urbanites in Tehran. And this was, of course, reflected in a rather limited and purely political but strategic slogan of "Where is my vote?" And as the repression of the movement increased, the rank and file of the movement, the kind of grassroots kind of radicalized, and made kind of more radical demands up to overthrow of the government, very radical slogans against the supreme leader and so on and so forth. And yet at the same time, the leadership of that movement, which somehow by default fell on the reformist figures, including the candidate whose objection or disputation of the election actually was at the immediate source of the movement, i.e. Mousavi, they increasingly stuck essentially what in Iranian political discourse is called as nizam, i.e. the system. So they saw the problem as more or less an intra-family dispute. And in that sense, in the last analysis, they saw their interest and fortunes with the system, with the state. Whereas the masses, at least sections of the movement itself, was increasingly getting radicalized. Now, of course, the fact that the demands, the slogan of the movement was so purely political, and even in being political was sort of very narrowly defined in terms of the votes, of course, it meant that it was unable to be appealing to broader sections of society and social classes. There was very little, if anything, about social justice, about gender equality, about the question of nationalities. And I think, the fact that major cities outside the Persian heartland of Iran were broadly quiet following early months suggests that, that slogan, that people didn't see that as their kind of, as their struggle. So in that sense, I think at the heart of the failure of the so-called Green Movement lies what I would describe the absence of a hegemonic discourse and program. And I use hegemonic in specifically Gramscian sense of the term. So in the sense that a discourse which was able to represent particular interest as general interest, and in that sense unify various grievances and struggles and protests within the society at large. Now, the fact that the leadership of that movement did not adopt more radical slogans, more inclusive one in terms of social justice and gender and nationalities is obviously not surprising. It reflects their ideological perspective as well as their class interests. I mean, it's not uncommon to associate so-called reform movement in Iran with so-called industrial capital, which is West-oriented. It tries and likes to be incorporated in global capitalism and liberal kind of world order and so on and so forth. And in that sense, and in fact, in practice, reformists have been the most kind of ferocious implementers of neoliberal political economy in Iran over the last 20, 30 years. So except for the character of Mir Hossein Mousavi, who has this legacy of being a sort of state kind of socialist, welfarist kind of politician of the 80s, there was very little in the agenda of the political movement to appeal to working classes and nationalities and women in particular. So when people, probably many of you have heard, they say, well, Iranian regime is not that strong really. It's surviving or it's on its feet because there is no really powerful or real opposition, which of course on the surface is not untrue. But this, if you look at it conceptually, it's precisely, I think, reflects the absence of a hegemonic discourse, which Iranian opposition has not been able to develop. And the reason that it has not been also is not accidental. It has to do with I think, deeper social and historical developments in Iran, some of which I will touch upon in a moment. And of course, I think it's important not to forget the willingness and the ability and capacity of the state apparatus for sustained repression, something which Islamic Republic is really perfected and in a way exported to places like Syria in advising Assad to brutally crack down on the protest early on, to prevent any constellation of protest within the cities, and kind of militarizing the Syrian revolution into something which was a much more possible, discursively at least, to describe as a kind of extremist Islamist movement, which eventually, of course, turned into one because of the external intervention and so on. But that initial strategy of ruthless suppression and not compromising in many ways, I think, reflects Iranian state's own treatment of the opposition movements within Iran, which has repeated in 2017, in November 2019, and so on. Hundreds, if not thousands of protesters were gunned down in different cities in Iran. And speaking of Syria, I think it's important to look at the regional and international dimension of Iranian politics and how Iranian state has been able to mobilize its particular foreign relation in terms of pacifying internal protest. So for example, this idea that we are preventing Syrianization of Iran, that if we don't fight ISIS in, well, they never really fought ISIS anyway, it was mostly Al-Qaeda. In Syria, ISIS will come to Iran, and this kind of politics of fear, which is very much resembling post 9/11 US politics, in some ways at least pacified part of, for a period of time at least, middle classes in Iran who had something to lose, unlike the working classes who have nothing to lose in a way, in the sense that it pacified their opposition. Now, so if I want to come back to the question of hegemony and slightly more address the second part of the question we were asked to reflect upon in terms of our research and teaching, I think Marxism's famous blind spot for gender is very, very well known. And I'm not in any case very qualified to discuss it here. So I don't mention that. But I think I want to reflect on the question of nation and nationalism in Marxism, and how reflecting upon that relates partly at least to the inability of left and progressive politics in Iran to be really a serious force. That has to do with the way in which, obviously, classical Marxism is famous. People like Tom Nunn and others have, or Benedict Anderson have described, how Marxism has always had difficulty with the question of nationalism and nation. It's either seen as a false consciousness or a kind of a contingent product of capitalism that will go away if capitalism is overcome. Nationalism is not a problem under socialism, and so on and so forth, which, if you look at the praxis of leftist forces in places like Iran and Turkey and elsewhere, it actually reflects that. For example, the Kurdish question, one of the most, the largest nationality question in the region, has been often neglected by these forces on the grounds that, well, socialism takes precedence. But this idea itself comes from a particular conception of capitalist development and history, in the sense that nationalism is a byproduct of capitalist development. Whereas I have tried in my research in more recent years to show actually this is flawed. In fact, the international dimension of capitalist development means that nation formation and nationalism, in fact, is constitutive of what is described as capitalism. And this is primarily because states like Iran and Turkey embarked upon, defensive modernization in the absence of capitalist relations internally. In that sense, nation was constructed before capitalism was in place. And because capitalism was constructed by the state itself, it was an extremely politicized set of relationship in which the conception of nationhood, and therefore the suppression of those cultural communities which were not included in the concept of nation, was at the heart of capitalist development itself, and the kind of pattern of class structure and social development, more generally. I always remember that famous line by Fanon, who says, when you go to the colonies, if you are white, you are rich. If you are rich, you are white. So in a way, the question of capital and national identity are not as distinct and separate as classical Marxists tend to think. So I have argued that, therefore, progressive and leftist politics in Iran has really little chance to become a real alternative, able to actually effectuate progressive change, unless it adopts a hegemonic discourse, which requires a kind of avoiding a hierarchization of struggles. The idea that somehow class struggle has an intrinsic precedence and priority over gender struggle, or somehow class struggle is prior to question of nationalities or national question. I think these are always already intertwined and mutually constitutive. So in a way, if you want to kind of maximize the appeal of your discourse, you cannot have this hierarchy, because it automatically excludes the potential political energy that this discourse can attract from large sections of a country like Iran, where actually so-called minorities constitute a majority if you put them together, as opposed to the kind of Persian-defined concept of nation. Similarly in Turkey. So I think one interesting example of such an attempt, although not as programmatically as I just described, but somehow in practice, can be seen in the kind of rise and quick fortunes of People's Democratic Party in Turkey, HDP, which I would say for precisely that reason, so kind of violently repressed by the Turkish state in recent years. Now, I'm not sure how much time I have spoken, but I want to conclude by some critical reflection also, on post-colonialism. I mean, I laid out my critique of Marxism, or at least classical Marxism, with regards to question of nationhood and so on. But recently I've been working on a concept which is tentatively I describe as inter-subaltern colonialism. And I think it, by which I'm trying to kind of capture the dynamics in a country like Iran or Turkey or Syria or Iraq, the major countries in the region, where you have a kind of post-colonial state which is subaltern in its international position, and yet it is colonial in its internal politics, partly because its reproduction as a nation state depends on colonial domination of those cultural groups which are excluded from the definition of the nation. Now, this is also actually has to do with the question of hegemony, because of course, Guha classically described how post-colonial state in India was not hegemonic. It was dominating rather than exercising hegemony. Now, given how post-colonialism has this close affiliation with subaltern studies, which Guha kind of initiated, it's interesting that this phenomenon of inter-subaltern colonialism, now of course this is my definition or description of it, people can describe it in different ways. I don't know, the nationalities question, the ethnic minorities question, the Kurdish question, the Azeri question, the Arab question in Iran, and so on. Nonetheless, it really is about how post-colonial state acts as a colonial state in its internal politics. Now, I have been trying to, think about why is it that a critical approach such as post-colonialism has not sufficiently, reflected on this issue, especially in the context of the Middle East. And there are a number of reasons. I think I will just very quickly go through them and end my talk. One is, I think, this extremely Eurocentric definition of colonialism. So rather than seeing it as a particular kind of practice of denying self-determination, as Yara was mentioning, it's kind of historically and conceptually associated with European and Western colonialism, which I think doesn't exhaust really the realities of post-colonial modernity in that sense. Now, this has meant that post-colonialism tends to be externalist in its normative critique, which is, concentrating more on the fact that these post-colonial states are subaltern in its international position, not, colonial in their internal politics. And this is reinforced by the fact that some of these states, like Iran and Syria, happen to be anti-imperialist, or rather they are at the receiving end of Western imperialism. So this gesture of anti-imperialism kind of accords them somehow by default some sort of critical respectability within at least some branches of post-colonial critique. The second question, I think, the second reason for this neglect is that, post-colonial nationalism is often critiqued from a class approach. And this has to do with Fanon's classical text, right? The pitfalls of national consciousness. So it's all about how after independence, national bourgeoisie is kind of dominating the nation and so on and so forth. Now, this particularly class dimension, I think, is obscuring the multiplicity of national questions within post-colonial states, such as Iran or Turkey and so on. Then the third one is what Sadiq Al-Azm famously described as Orientalism in reverse. So somehow anti-Orientalism flattens the Orientalist hierarchy, or actually reverses it. So rather than superiority of the West over the East, somehow East is kind of seen in a very nice way. And somehow the totalization of Orientalist imaginary is kind of reproduced in some of the anti-Orientalist literature itself. And finally, I think this is something which I have written on, which is because post-colonialism has this legacy of post-structural critique, it's fundamentally opposed to general theory because it's associated with the universal, which is therefore seen as repressive and homogenizing. Now, I have shown that this is incorrect in the sense that what they are critiquing is a particular conception of the universal, one which is internalist and Eurocentric. So one can have a universal which is, multiple and interactive and so on, rather than homogenizing. But because they are opposing general theory, I think normatively they tend to blur the line between an immanent critique and immanent critique of cultures and cultural relativism. And that somehow kind of blunts the edge of their critique against post-colonial states, again, such as Iran and Turkey and Syria and other states in the region. So basically, I think this with this idea of inter-subaltern colonialism, I think it involves turning post-colonial critique back on itself in order to maximize and kind of fulfill its critical potential. And I think if beyond this conceptual discussion, many of you have noticed from the way in which people have taken position with regards to Syrian conflict or Iran, repression of the protest movement, that actually these are not pure conceptual issues. It informs critical thinkers and activists' approach to those kind of protests and movements. My apologies for running actually over time, but I stop here and thank you all.